A total economy is one in which everything, life forms, for instance, or the right to pollute, is private property and has a price and is for sale. In a total economy, significant and sometimes critical choices that once belonged to individuals or communities become the property of corporations. A total economy operating internationally necessarily shrinks the powers of state and national governments, not only because those governments have signed over significant powers to an international bureaucracy or because political leaders become paid hacks of the corporations, but also because political processes, and especially democratic processes, are too slow to react to unrestrained economic and technological development on a global scale. And when state and national governments begin to act in effect as agents of the global economy, selling their people for low wages and their people's products for low prices, then the rights and liberties of citizenship must necessarily shrink. A total economy is an unrestrained taking of profits from the disintegration of nations, communities, households, landscapes, and ecosystems. It licenses symbolic or artificial wealth to grow by means of the destruction of the real wealth of all the world. Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. The opening is from Wendell Berry's essay, The Total Economy. This essay is exciting, it's mind-expanding, it's liberating, and despite being 25 years old, it's actually describing the world we live in today. Berry saw what was coming, and he's warning us about it. It talks about deindustrialization, the kind that is in the news today about in the Midwest in America. It talks about tariffs in the trade war, again, things that are in the news cycle now. And it also talks about the great scourge of globalization. But before I get into this, I'd like to remind everyone of the trade war that I am waging, and that is to trade your money for my book. You can support this channel and you can discover new literature by getting a copy of Commuting. You can link to it in the description. You can also link to the Gymnasia Press website, where you can get the short story collection Comorbidities and the novel Non-Local. Get all three and discover something about yourself. The section that I read from Berry's essay, where he is talking about the total economy, given us language to use to describe this phenomenon, that does not come at the beginning of the essay, it comes near the end. So the essay works to build up to this concept and define what it is. The essay actually begins, though, with the environmental crisis. Wendell Berry is not only a writer, he's also a farmer. He cares about nature, his local community, the environment, but he's not your typical environmental activists looking at how corporations can buy carbon offsets and all that kind of thing. No, and actually at the beginning, he's kind of given a shot towards these types of folks. So in the opening, he talks about the environmental crisis, and he says that this crisis is actually a problem of oversimplification. He words this very nicely. He says, as issues rise into popularity, they rise also into the danger of oversimplification. And he's talking about the environmental issue. As it becomes more popular, it's becoming oversimplified. And the oversimplification that he sees in the environmental crisis is that because we don't fully understand it, we think it is just a political issue and that we can solve it through changing our values, trying to get governments to change their values. But it's not going to be changed through values. It really needs to be changed through practices. He says that the environmental crisis is really because the human household is in conflict everywhere with nature's household. And we don't really understand where those problems are, again, because the issue is oversimplified. And this is built really on top of an oversimplification of the economy. And that oversimplification is given proxies, that's the word he uses, to corporations to basically produce our food, provide our clothing, our shelter, to do everything that we need. We're giving this off to other people. We don't really understand the process behind it, and we're just delegating it to others. And because we don't understand it, it's this simplified notion that we have of it. And this brings us to, or brings him to, I think, one of the most interesting things he says at the beginning of this essay, which is that the environmental crisis is not a crisis of environs or surroundings. It is a crisis of our lives as individuals, as family members, as community members, and as citizens. We have an environmental crisis because we have consented to an economy in which by eating, drinking, working, resting, traveling, and enjoying ourselves, we are destroying the natural, the God-given world. So we've given these proxies to the corporations to provide everything we need, and we're not doing it ourselves. We've destroyed our lives as individuals. We've destroyed our, as he says here, lives as family members and community members. And the crisis that we're seeing in the environment is really a reflection of that. So it's actually a reflection of a crisis of how we're living. So I think this is the perspective we don't often get when we're talking about the environmental issues. It's let's just change this or that in the economy, and that will solve the issue. And he's saying, no, it's our practice, how we're actually conducting ourselves in the world. He then goes on to talk about communism and free market capitalism, which he views both of these as modern oligarchies. He says that both produce propaganda that basically justifies violent means to good ends. So we need to destroy the forest now, and the good end comes later. We need to pollute the world now for later prosperity. And so this is the theme that both of these oligarchies share. And then he goes on to focus more on the free market. He says that the single principle of free market capitalism is produce wherever at lowest cost and consume wherever at the highest price. And I think that's a really important principle because this really shapes the total economy and it shapes how we behave in our lives. He goes on to say that the global free market dissolves the boundaries of old colonialisms and replaces it with a new colonialism that is without restraint or boundaries. So in order to produce wherever at the lowest cost and then consume wherever at the highest price, you're getting that's an exploitative colonial action, and it's starting now existing around the world. And in order to do this, there's several things we need. So this is where he sees already some problems entering this system. We need a surplus of consumers and money and unlimited wants. So society needs to be shaped psychologically to always want things. People need to be forced out, or encouraged, coerced out of the countryside and into the city. And it's in the city where they need to depend on these proxies to provide their food, clothing, and shelter. And they introduce labor replacing technology. So all these things create a pool of people who do not have job security. They need to get kind of any job they can get, and they need to count on these proxies. And then developing more this idea of free market capitalism. What are the problems with it? He calls it a sentimentality, this idea that we're seeing exploitation and we're trying to call it free competition. He's saying it's not actually free competition. It's actually more of the law of war. There's going to be one competitor that comes out on top, and everyone else is going to suffer for this. So when they talk about things like efficiency in labor, really what they mean is lower labor costs. And again, that affects the worker. He says that the global economy is based on cheap long-distance transportation in order to produce anywhere, wherever it's cheapest, and then consume wherever it's the highest. You're going to need cheap long-distance transportation. And this is going to drive nations to abandon economic self-sufficiency. And this is kind of the real evil that Berry sees in this system. And they're going to try to just specialize in production of maybe a few commodities just to transport them, and they're not going to focus on the things that they really need within their own community. And he even talks about how certain experts have said, this is back in 2000, that the UK and the US should abandon agriculture altogether because it's too costly. And he certainly says experts here with some derision. And this reminded me of the recent Dave Smith, Douglas Murray debate on Joe Rogan, and with a lot of talk about what an expert means. And with expert advice like this, you can see why many people do not trust the experts. This leads Berry into enumerating 14, he calls assumptions of the free market. I'm not going to read all these, but I think the 12th one is quite important because it gets at, maybe we can call an externality of this system that is really damaging to culture. So this is number 12. He says, vocation is a dead issue. One does not do the work that one chooses to do because one is called to it by heaven or by one's natural abilities, but does instead the work that is determined and imposed by the economy. So really we have this vocation being replaced by an economic determinism. People are not doing the things that they are passionate or skillful about, but actually just what the economy demands of them and what they need. Again, remember, they have job insecurity. And this loss of vocation, according to Berry, destroys human character and therefore culture inside. And I think that is correct. And I think that could go a long way in explaining a lot of the ills that we see in society today. And Berry actually uses even stronger words where he says that justice and vocation are inseparable. So to deny someone a vocation or a system that denies them a vocation is actually an injustice. This brings us to the part that I read at the opening. I'm not going to reread that part, but there's one section that I think is worth rereading because I think this captures kind of really the main thrust and argument of this essay. And that's near the end of that paragraph. He says, a total economy is an unrestrained taking of profits from the disintegration of nations, communities, households, landscapes, and ecosystems. So the total economy is really this profit grabbing from the disintegration, the destruction of the ecosystem, of communities, and even nations. And remember, this was in 2000 when he said this, but I think this is really, over these 25 years, this has really come to fruition. And you can even hear in some places like, I'm thinking maybe the World Economic Forum calling for, like the end of nation states. The globalists certainly want this. From here, Wendell Berry gives us some traditional means of what he says protection against the concentration of great wealth and power, which comes about through this globalization. The traditional means that we have to protect ourselves from this are things like laws against trusts and monopolies, principles of collective bargaining, income tax, the progressive income tax, tariffs, and tariffs on cheap imports. And he says that all of these are justified really to protect livelihoods and freedoms within a community, but unfortunately, they are not meaningfully enacted in society. And he says further that the global economy is intended as a means of subverting these practices. So these are the practices that we have to protect communities. The global economy is actually there to subvert these. And when these powers are not taken, he says that they fall back into the citizens' hands, and this is where we need to do something. So this is the part of the essay where he gets into his solution, though I don't think this is a solution many will find appealing because it involves hard work and life change of habits. So he says that the solution to the total economy is the local economy. And the two principles of local economy is neighborhood and subsistence. So remember, the problem with the total economy is the consumer does not know anything about the products that they're consuming. They don't know where they're coming from. They don't know the toxins that are in them. They don't know the true costs of these, the true human costs of these. And also, the community itself is not a viable community because it has really just focused on a few things to make solely for export, and it's also allowed cheap products to come in, which pushes out its ability, its capacity to make anything meaningful within this community. So he thinks we need to return to making things in our community. He says that the globalists, and he actually used this word back in 2000, the globalists will call this protectionism, and he's saying, yes, that's exactly what it is. We need to have this level of protectionism in order to preserve these communities. And this reminded me of what Chung Ha-jun, the Korean British economist, he talks about tariffs being used to protect infant industries. And that's really, he seems to be implying that's the only real purpose for these. Berry would be arguing, and I think I would agree with him, that, well, it's not only for infant industries, but it's also for communities. We need to protect communities and their industries, their local industries, by not allowing cheap products from other places. And he puts this very nicely, that in a way that highlights the reciprocity of economic policies. He says, the principle of neighborhood at home always implies the principle of charity abroad. So by maintaining and supporting neighborhood at home, you're going to be given charity abroad by not allowing slave labor or low, cheap labor to exist another place abroad, and you'll allow those people to focus on the things that they need to make for their local communities. And that in itself is a charity. And as a way to illustrate this, he talks about an anecdote from an African village where whenever the timber industry was doing really well, famine was basically reigning in this African village because they put all their energy into trying to cut down as many trees as possible instead of just what they needed, and then they were not focusing on the crops and the things that they need. And this is really supposed to illustrate the situation that we're in now. We are not focusing on the things we need. We're just focusing on the things that we export, and we're getting the things that we need cheaply from other places, even though we don't truly understand them. And this total economy really brings in a total government and what Berry calls a global colonialism. And this essay really gives a picture of this, I think a very compelling picture, and it's thought-provoking in ways that we could change it. So he ends by saying that in this system, the people have no power, the land has no voice, and he's really calling for people to gain their power by getting back on the land, trying to produce their own things, listening to the land, and rekindling with that voice of the land. So this is, I think, a powerful essay. I highly recommend it. I think everyone should read this and compare it to what we're hearing in the mainstream news about the trade war and tariffs and those things, and I guess come to your own conclusion about what's the best way to live in a society, in a neighborhood, in a community. Thank you.